Okay, this video I'm gonna try and cover chapter one as best I can. Hopefully, I don't rush too much at the end and pace myself appropriately. Just a reminder that I will go over the plot points first. It'll probably take me a minute or two to do the plot points. We'll walk through it just to catch us up, and then we'll go to my notes. Okay. Chapter one starts with a monologue. I don't know if you're familiar with this strategy, but this particular book does utilize that strategy of having little italicized monologues that, kind of they're a little bit mysterious, philosophical, and they're by the sheriff, who we don't meet right away. We meet him a little bit later on, but now we have his voice, right? And so the voice establishes some things. This particular monologue is about a killer that was executed, that he was at an execution or at least it starts that way. They say the eyes are windows of the soul. I don't know what them eyes was the windows to, and I guess I'd as soon not know. Tells you a little bit about the language, right? A little bit about the character, a lot about sort of the way his philosophy of life works, if you can call it that. And just overall, just kind of a jaded figure that has been on death row, that has been a sheriff presumably for a long time. You definitely get that impression. After the monologue, you have Chigurh introduced. He's a cold-blooded killer. This is the en media res thing. He's already arrested, right? So we don't know exactly why he's there, except that he's arrested and he frees himself essentially and kills the law enforcement officer there. He kills the sheriff and then another person. From this point we shift point of views again back to that idea of point of view. Should we shift to Llewellyn again without it's sort of abrupt, later on we kind of get used to it, we kind of get used to the rhythm, but at this point it abruptly shifts to Llewellyn, who finds money, and again we're sort of plopped in the middle of this thing, right? He's just out shooting and he runs across this scene. He goes home with some money. He finds presumably it's some kind of deal that's gone bad, and a lot of people are dead in this thing, in this place. And so he goes home, and at that point, he could have just he was contemplating what he was going to do with this $2 million, or millions of dollars. I don't remember the exact figure, but he decides he's going to go back, and it's because the guy wanted water. Something simple, small, but something that probably like heightens our attention, saying, it's sort of like that horror movie where it's like, don't go back in there, right? That's probably what we're asking ourselves at this point. But again, we're just presented with the character, right? So we accept that this character would do it just because that's the world that this is presenting. He's maybe a little naive about it. He even mentions that, right? So again, we're just talking about point of view. We're presented with these characters. Maybe we make judgments on them about the realism or unrealism, but that's not sort of our job yet. We're just sort of trying to establish sort of the rules of this world. Okay, so keep that in mind as you read through. After he goes back, he's chased by men looking for money. Okay, so that's the basic plot elements. And so going on to the notes, some of the structural elements. We're introduced to Chigurh first, right, in the main plot. We might ask ourselves why. Okay, this is obviously a pretty extreme character, and we're just he's sort of thrown at us, right? And then it's followed immediately by Llewellyn. That juxtaposition, meaning, these two pieces are being put next to each other, right? And they don't seem to fit exactly, except for maybe the area that they're both in. So again, that's an authorial choice, right? It shifts from one point of view to another, and it's just sort of presented that way, and these pieces aren't quite fitting just yet, okay? Pretty common in crime books, right? We kind of know what's going on, but we kind of don't know how everything connects, and even novels in general, right? Llewellyn, some of the things that we can point out to, and that should probably be 18. Some of the things that we can point out to as far as character goes, that's how you can tell that I care about you, because I'm actually putting this together all by myself, right? So, some of the things we can tell by the way the author presents these characters through the narrative, some little details that maybe tell a bigger picture, and I pointed out a couple of these that may be useful later on when we're developing sort of character, the idea of character. So his whole life was sitting there in front of him, so he's, you can imagine it's sort of like winning the lottery. You're like looking at the numbers and saying, okay, I'm not quite sure how to process this, right? So the author allows that time for the character to sort of not really understand what's going on. He just knows this is big, right? And then also, you have to take this seriously. This is Llewellyn talking to himself, right? You can't treat it like luck. He's sort of talking himself down, but that tells you a lot about the character too, right? There's a little bit of already a note of insecurity, a note of, I'm a screw up. I know it. I'm not perfect. What do I do? So a lot of things, right? It's sort of like an iceberg, right? You get a little bit, and then you can read a whole lot into it if you really want to. Some of the things I also point out here, short bursts of sentences sort of follow a time span. Sometimes a sentence, it's one thing to pay attention to maybe later on, maybe not the first time you're reading it through always, because it could be a little distracting, but notice how the sentences work. Some of them are sort of longer, and this seems like a minor point, but it does tell you a little bit about sort of the flow of the story, is that when you have short bursts of sentences, structurally, what that does is it means you're moving from one thing to the next, right? Sort of like pop, 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 right? It doesn't take a lot of time for the reader to process short sentences. So whenever you read something that's like really short sentences or really direct sentences, it's sort of popping you through the narrative, right? It's sort of pacing you. And then when you get to the longer sentences, it's sort of telling you, okay, slow down, right? You're doing this as a reader, whether you know it or not, unconsciously sometimes. Just a little fiction writing, suggestion there too, if you're interested. But that's another thing to maybe you might pay attention to, right? Maybe you won't, but it's something that I noticed right away, is that it does sort of mix things up, and it does play around with the reader a little bit in terms of how the time spans work and how the pacing goes. He was a strong believer in a shotgun. Okay, that's another line that I point out because it seems to indicate his familiarity. He seems to be in control of his thoughts. He sort of knows what he knows. And that's not, to me, a contradiction with what I said earlier about his insecurities. It's like he knows what he knows. He knows what he doesn't know, and he knows kind of when things don't make sense, right? And he's self-aware enough to know that, but maybe not so self-aware that he can't read through it, if that makes sense. But anyway, there's a lot of things going on with this character in a very short amount of time that we can pick apart with just the language. You notice I'm just picking apart really a few sentences and expanding all this other stuff. To me, that's decent analysis, right? That's what you want to do, and then start making those connections as well. Again, like I say in the introduction, I'm just modeling the behavior that I think is going to come naturally if you wind up being more of an English majory kind of person, if you aren't already. So the dialogue, I would say, is realistic. I'm moving down to the next point. It tends to be realistic in that it's not just two people like explaining everything that's going on, in their heads. It's actually two people sort of bouncing off of each other. And one of the things about dialogue is that if you do read enough of it, or if you do try to construct it, and if you actually listen to sort of what people say, there's a lot of this, right? Hand movements, and there's a lot of, and sometimes when we talk, we don't always, say those things. Or we say, and then there's a lot that the responder can read into that if they already have some things in their head that they're working from in the past, right? And that's another way of saying is that I say something to you, and if you're just reading it statically, like if you're having a real conversation, I can say something to you and you'll say something to me that seems totally unrelated, right? But then that shifts the conversation to a different point, right? And there's a suggestion that I'm acknowledging what you're saying and then moving on to the next thing, right? But in a dialogue, the temptation, if you're sort of, really straightforward dialogue that's just sort of saying, we're going to do this and then we're going to do that. And unrealistic dialogue tends to be very expository. It's explaining things that both the speaker and the person that's receiving the information kind of already know in real life. In real life, you wouldn't sort of explain everything. You would just sort of say something, and then the responder would just in their head go, oh, yeah, okay. And then just sort of move on. They don't need to necessarily acknowledge and say, yes, I understand your point. Your point is very interesting, and it does relate to this other thing too. And now I'm going to present to you this other thing. And then you start the other thing, right? You don't do that mostly, right? Unless, there's a really particular kind of dialogue that you're having. So anyway, just something to note when you're looking at the dialogue, sort of the way the dialogue is a stylistic choice. Another thing to pay attention to is that imagery and language is very descriptive, especially when it comes to sort of the narrator and stuff, the narrator or narrators. But point of view tends to be, and I won't say that this is exclusively, but tends to be mostly third person limited, meaning that whoever's sort of narrating the story, or we're seeing it from their point of view. And it's not first person. It's just very close, sort of, you're following them around and you can kind of only see what they're seeing, right? And then when it shifts the point of view, that's a little bit abrupt because it's sort of like we're standing behind somebody else now, right? So think about third person limited as just sort of this little camera that goes into their head a little bit, maybe just on the surface, and then goes out to what they see. And what we are looking at is sort of like what they're seeing and how it sort of fires those synapses, right? And so we don't always know the entire history of what they're saying. We can't go that deep, but third person limited still keeps us third person, but it's limited to their particular perspective and sort of how they're neurologically, essentially, mentally responding, right? Not their whole history. They don't relate to you their whole history every time they see it. Okay, that would be a little bit more omniscient, if I could use that term. But anyway, for further commentary on this, you might want to refer to the Penguin Reader Robot point of view. Okay, real quick here so that I can finish up this chapter in one video. We have Llewellyn hesitates and goes back. One of the questions that we ask almost right away whenever I read this is, why did he go back for the water? That's a really good question, and it's not fully explained except through the character of Llewellyn, right? Not the smartest guy, seems to want to kind of do the right thing, but not really all the time. And he seems to be sort of self-aware, but not entirely, in control, but not all the place, right? This is a flawed guy, right? You know, he's not perfect. He's not super genius kind of, you know, mastermind, right? But he is in control of his facilities, right? And there are things that he has a very deliberate control over. And we get the sense that he has an awareness of himself. He has a mastery over the landscape and the area, but there's nothing, he can't imagine, his imagination doesn't get big enough where he can sort of look beyond sort of what's in front of him sometimes. Okay, there's no description of a fool. These are internal monologues where he's self-deprecating, and I'll just sort of leave that there. You can pause this later if you want, if I'm going too fast, or if you need to rewind and then come back, that's perfectly okay. While Llewellyn is lying in the desert waiting for a moment of character background with only a few words. Okay, so this is a point where I just point out, with just a few words, it relates a lot about the character. When he's laying there, he goes, he's had this feeling before. This is the narrator, right? It shifts to sort of a narrator. He's had this feeling before in another country, right? There's a suggestion that he's a veteran and that this is that same tension that he's felt before, right? So packs a lot of character into a very short period of time. So make note of that. Note again the action, the pacing at the end. I don't know for you, but for me, chapter 1 ends sort of with a bang, right? It's just like lots of action, you know, present in the moment, that kind of thing, right? You know, not a lot of delays, not a lot of sort of seeping into philosophy. It's just suddenly the plot sort of really focuses and sort of shifts forward really fast. Okay, so that's what I got for you for chapter 1. The next one is going to cover chapter 2, and I will see you then. Thanks.